human beings, as very sentient men and women, aspire to a better kind of a society, to a society that is more joyous, that is less cruel, then they have other things to do than simply to dream or to bemoan the fact that there are great numbers of defeats. That really what human beings and men and women who are sentient about social change have to do always is to learn from the past and to learn especially from defeats. And we talk about that German Revolution of 1918 and 19. And that German Revolution is very poor in accomplishments from any revolutionary standard. But it is very rich in lessons. And before we pass on from it, we must underscore those lessons because they are the kinds that will recur over and again in 20th century social movements. And it should occur to you to begin with how very difficult it is and how much the German Revolution demonstrates it, how very difficult it is for working men and women, for people who have long been subject to subordination, really ever to feel that they have the power within their hands to make another kind of society. In other words, even when there is real potentiality at hand, even when workers have made strikes and come very close to forming government, then there has been a very great difficulty in translating those actions into a reality. There is a sense really of a lack of confidence. There is a sense really of the historical accretion of so long a period of time that men who toil with their hands really cannot organize another society. And what I'm talking about is that in Germany in 1918, in November, you do establish all over that country workers' councils. And those workers' councils, after all, represent a form of autogestion, represent a form of worker self-government. And consequently, the point on the part of the workers should have been that that was the center of power. And yet those workers, after all, even when they had been politicized, had been part of a social democratic party before 1914, which had always taught them that ultimately power would have to be exercised by a democratic parliament. That ultimately, when the revolution came, it would be some kind of representative government that ultimately would make the changes. And so when the choice came as between councils in which working men themselves devolved the power upon themselves in their local areas, or went out to elect a parliamentary government, they chose the parliamentary form, they stayed with the SPD, and all of the entreaties of the independent socialists and of the Spartakists who became the communists were of no avail. Most of the workers resisted the very power that seemed to be on the horizon for them. And that is a profoundly important point, because it takes a tremendous amount of acute consciousness for people to think that they can do things that through all of history they are told that they are not competent to do. And if the German Revolution teaches us that, it teaches us something else of great importance, and that is how quickly and how easily the ruling classes realize that they can use reformism, that they can use even reform socialism in order to keep the bulwark of their power. And that is exactly what the German ruling classes did in 1918 and 19. They yielded certain reforms, and those reforms are not inconspicuous. The industrialists came together and yielded the 8-hour day, which had been so striven for by the workers. And they yielded unemployment compensation, and they yielded arbitration commissions within industry. But they did that in a collaboration with the Social Democratic Party in order to keep the bulk of what had been theirs, the bulk of their enterprise. And consequently, what they succeeded in doing was to make the Social Democratic Party their stalking horse, to allow that party to contain the working class until the revolutionary storm should pass. And in giving that Social Democratic Party power, those industrialists knew full well that once the German economy recovered, they could dispense with socialism completely. And that is precisely what they did in the middle of the 1920s, when, after all, that SPD was thrown out of office, having done this particular job. And if that German Revolution demonstrates that, it demonstrates a third thing of equal importance. And that is that for moderate and reformist socialists, there is a kind of discovery which is a sort of ghoulish discovery. And that is that there is a greater danger on the left to moderate socialism than on the right. It was, after all, the behavior of the SPD
to say that really the great danger came from the insurrectionaries or the revolutionaries on the left, and that it was perfectly feasible to make an alliance with the army, to make an alliance with the industrialists in order to contain and rein in that revolutionary threat from the left. And so what you have is the SPD dissolving the Workers' Council, dissolving the Commission on Socialized Industry, and when there is protest, when there is mere insurrection in January of 1919, making that alliance with the army and crushing that insurrection. And not only crushing it, but killing those leaders of that insurrectionary left, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, finally in March, Leo Yogaches, and consequently denuding that movement of its brains and of its talent and of its spirit. And consequently, you get really a kind of strange alliance between a socialist movement that now finds it very much more convenient to collaborate with those who have been its former enemies against those who form to the left of it. And a fourth consequence flows from that, and it is a powerful lesson again. And that is that the disenchantment of workers leads to a certain kind of depoliticization. That the workers in Germany, after all, expected considerable things in 1919. The elections of January of 1919 to the Reichstag had elected socialist parties who controlled 46% of the seats. And in addition to that, the two moderate middle-class parties, the Catholic Center Party and the German Democratic Party, both of them complained that they were really socialist parties in spirit and insisted that they wanted to socialize certain brands of industry. In short, the workers had every reason to expect in 1919 that there would be a considerable evolution toward a socialist society, considerable socialization of the means of production. And when that did not happen, and they went out on strike or they took to the streets and were repressed, there is the beginning of a kind of depoliticization on the part of the German working class, which plays, of course, its tremendous havoc in the period of the end of the 1920s, in the face of the Nazi menace, in the face of the menace of National Socialism. Because what you do is you kick the stuffing out of a working class that had depended upon its parties and that saw its illusions smashed in that revolution of 1918 and 19. But there is yet another lesson, and that has to be underscored at every turn in the period of the 1920s and 30s. And that is that if you are to make a real social revolution, if you are to move from the capitalist sources of society to the socialist sources, then you must either do what Rosa Luxemburg insisted or what Lenin insisted. And Rosa Luxemburg insisted that you could not make such a socialist revolution unless you had really the acute revolutionary consciousness of a majority of the exploited people. In other words, at that moment, when the process of action, when the very process of life had so radicalized the masses that they were prepared to go all the way in installing a socialist society. Or what Lenin and the Bolsheviks insisted, that if you did not have quite that acute consciousness, at least you had to have what is called that dictatorship of the proletariat. In other words, you had to use force for a period of time in order to extirpate the roots of an old society, in order to smash that old army, that old bureaucracy, that old industrial class. And what happened in Germany was that neither of those things prevailed. Neither had there been enough praxis so that there really was a revolutionary mentality among the masses widely generalized, nor was there any experience in which the old order really was ripped up by the roots. The only example that you have in that German Revolution of anything like an effort to establish a socialist society, or a communist society, if you please, is that short episode in Bavaria in the period of 1919, from the 21st of February to the 9th of April of 1919, when there is established a Bavarian Soviet Republic. And that experience really demonstrates the point I am trying to make. What happened in Bavaria was that on the 9th of November, in that great wave of strikes which overthrew the old monarchy, there was a powerful movement that was centered in the city of Munich. And that movement of strikes by workers upset the Bavarian monarchy and established what was called a socialist republic under the leadership of Kurt Eisner. Now, Eisner was an exceptionally sensitive man, was a left-wing independent socialist, and established what was called a socialist republic in Bavaria, but that socialist republic had no intention, right from the very beginning, of trying to make a dictatorship of the proletariat or really going at the old society with hammer and tongs. What Eisner and his group fought in Munich in 1918 and 19 was that they would call a Landtag. In other words, they would call together a parliament, and hopefully that parliament would make certain very profound structural reforms. But you must remember, after all, that this action of November in Bavaria was a sudden, spontaneous action, and that Munich is Red Munich, but the rest of Bavaria is Catholic, conservative, landholding Bavaria. And consequently, if you call it a Landtag and have those elections, surely the old landlords and the Catholic peasantry will opt for the conservative side, and there will be a very real struggle over whether you will have a republic of councils or again a conservative republic represented by the Landtag. That was the point of struggle, and that government of Eisner did nothing to cope with the roots of the old order. The result was that a very conservative Landtag was in fact elected in February of 1919, and the very day, on the 21st of February, that Eisner tried to open that Landtag, he himself was assassinated by a right-wing army officer. And it is that assassination of Eisner that sets off a kind of explosion in the city of Munich, and there is a seizure of power by the workers. The workers' council rise up and consequently proclaim a Bavarian Soviet Republic. In other words, a kind of communist state centered here in Munich, but with no infrastructure of support outside that city at all. And you know that Bavarian Soviet Republic is kind of a comic opera thing, and really, in a way, rather tragic, because the people that were involved in it were among the most enlightened, among the most intellectual, among the most magnificent human beings. That Soviet council in Bavaria was headed by Gustav Landauer, and Landauer, after all, one of the great intellectuals in modern socialism, about whom Martin Buber wrote so very eloquently in that book, Paths in Utopia. And Landauer himself, a kind of non-violent man, a man who had written very good books on Shakespeare, on Helderman, a man who really was steeped in intellectual affairs, and who was a kind of anarcho-communist, who believed in the devolution of power into little decentralized groups, who believed in cooperative production, a very beautiful man, Landauer, suddenly at the head of this impossible Soviet Republic. With him, the playwright Ernst Haller, who is his right-hand man. Ernst Haller, who becomes the greatest communist playwright in that particular epoch, and who fights the communist cause with his pen. And so you get these intellectuals in this particular government, all of them good-spirited, all of them who had sat about Munich, conceiving of what the better society would be like. And parenthetically, I have something of the sense of what the spirit of that Bavarian Soviet was, because one of the members of that government was a magnificent man whom I came to know extremely well. It was Erich Kahler, who just died this very last year, a very old man. Erich Kahler, one of the really splendid literary critics and philosophers of history, the profile of a magnificent mind at work every time that Kahler spoke. And Kahler came one year when I was teaching in Ohio State University, and came as some sort of honored professor, and lived in an apartment across the hall from mine. Well, Erich Kahler, you know, could not drive an automobile. I can barely drive one. He certainly couldn't drive one. And so I chauffeured Kahler for a year, and saw that man at work, and thought to myself, my God, this man was a minister, was a commissar in this Bavarian Soviet in 1919, and was really the most magnificent romantic you can possibly imagine. Somebody who had this terrific sense, really, of people. Whenever he saw them, he had two hands and two legs. He was in love with it. Somebody who was going to save the world in that way, and one day, you know, if you know Congress at all, and hopefully you don't. I was driving yards down West Broad Street, which is the main drag in Columbus. We were to get out of the city, and in that whole area of East and West Broad Street are nothing but used car lots. It's terrible used car lots. And we were driving by once, and there was a terrible man who had a very large used car lot called Lex Mayer. And he had this car lot, and one day, it was a Saturday, he hired this hillbilly band. And he was there with cowboy costume, and there was this hillbilly band. We were driving by, and at that point, Collar was telling me all about his last visitations with Thomas Mann, and we were passing by, and the hideous music comes down, and he said, "Stop, stop." I said, "Why?" Of the folk. No, he went out and they were offering these free Coca-Colas, likewise to inhibit your health. All over the place he went, and there were these used car people trying to sell him cars, and he came back and he said, "With people, they talk to you." Culture, if the Bavarians said yes. I told you that there was a certain romanticism about this, you understand what I mean. They did raise an army, to be sure. And there was an engineer from Kiel, kind of a courageous, quixotic character, who raised an army of some 20,000 troops, some 20,000 workers. Some were adventurers, some were ex-prisoners of war, and so forth. But obviously, it had no infrastructure of support, it had no structure of program or strategy in order to install itself, and certainly by April of 1919, the Freikorps, with the help of the Social Democratic ministers in Berlin, had crushed this Bavarian Soviet. And what I'm saying is that you cannot simply, in that sort of barren soil, attempt to do anything. That was the only example of an attempt to make some other kind of socialist society, and obviously it had none of the preparation that either Rosa Luxemburg or Lenin were to talk about. And so you have this immense and monumental failure of the German Revolution of 1918 and 19. And yet, if you have that failure, and on that German Revolution, the Russians, after all, had pinned so very many of their hopes. If you have that revolution failing, what will the reaction of the Russians be? The reaction must be phrased in terms of 1919. If the German Revolution collapsed, it was thought to collapse momentarily, because 1919 and 1920 are years of an offensive, are years really of a revolutionary offensive. What difference that the German Revolution momentarily has failed? If there are massive strikes in France, if there are strikes in Finland, if there is an actual communist attempt in Hungary, in other words, you have revolutionary Europe. And from the viewpoint of Lenin and his friends in Russia, the need was for coordination of all of the revolutionary activities. If the German Revolution had failed, it was because there wasn't a European infrastructure, a European support for it, and consequently, what was needed was a new international. A new international, a revolutionary international, which should bring within its cadre not old social democratic parties, but new communist parties, parties that split off from those social democratic parties, that corralled all of the revolutionary forces in their country. In other words, parties that really had a commitment to revolution and an international that had centralization. That was not like the Second International, but that could direct a general strategy and consequently ensure the success of that European revolution. And all of that seemed all the more pressing in the early months of 1919 because the Second International tried to reform and to restructure itself in February of 1919. In February of 1919, the Corps rises. And consequently, there is an international congress of the Second International in the city of Bern in Switzerland. And through that Congress of the Second International, trying to recover from its tremendous colossal losses in the course of the war, from August of 1914, from its failure to pull off the Stockholm Peace Conference in 1917, trying to recover. and 44 parties were represented at that Congress of 1919 in Bern, representing 33 different countries. And there were some large parties represented. The British Labour Party, with some 4 million members. The German SPD, with over 1 million members. The Belgian Socialist Party, with 500,000 members. It was not inconspicuous, except that it was impossible. It was impossible because the war had happened, and the Second International had been shattered by the war, and that the entire period of the war, it had not been able to call a single international peace conference. That Second International could be reformed and reconstructed only if it coped with 2 problems and tried to reorganize its strategy by confronting those 2 problems. One problem was the war itself. Why that war had found the Second International so helpless. It had to confront that, and it had to confront the Russian Revolution. Why the Russians were able to make a revolution in October of 1917, and the only ones who were. And when you get to Bern in February of 1919, it's hopeless. Because in the first place, the Bolsheviks aren't there. And if the Bolsheviks aren't there and boycott the Congress, it means the only successful revolutionaries have written off the Second International. In the second place, among the parties that sent delegates, those delegates were divided into majoritaire and minoritaire, into those who still supported the war stance of their parties and those who opposed. There was veritable fratricide on the floor at Bern. And consequently, what kind of an international was this when out of the same party men stood and accused each other of treason or of betrayal? And on neither of the key points, neither in interpretation of 1914 nor in taking a stand on the Russian Revolution, was the Bern Congress able to pass a resolution. There was too much controversy, too much confusion, and so you have a Second International claiming, after all, to reconstruct itself, but which has no new hope, no new offering, no new strategy. How to corral the inflamed hopes of the workers with a party like the British Labour Party, which dominated that Second International. It is in that context that Lenin and his friends say, all right, we must form a third international. And the invitation for that third international coincides in February of 1919 with the meeting of the second at Bern. And it is important for us to note something parenthetically. And that is that before she died, Rosa Luxemburg was apprised of this effort to form a third international and was opposed to it. And why she was opposed to it is terribly important and should not be lost in passing. It had nothing to do with the Russian Revolution. She approved and praised the Russian Revolution, as you know, in that brochure that you have read. And she thought it was a heroic and courageous act. In addition to that, her own relations with Lenin, which were, at best, distended relations, and always a bit friction, those relations began to get better. These are old embattled militants. And by December 18th of 1918, she is writing to Lenin, "Dear Vladimir, hearty greetings from the family, Karl, Richard, Franz, Mary, and the others. May God grant that the coming year will fulfill all of our fondest wishes. Very affectionately, Rosa." And so there is a kind of growing together. With Lenin, one doesn't know. Because Lenin wrote one article about Rosa Luxemburg devoted completely to her after her death. And that article was not published until 1924 in the Pravda. And there he cited a very bizarre Russian adage about to describe Rosa Luxemburg. And the adage from the Russian reads, "An eagle can sometimes fly lower than a chicken, but a chicken can never rise to the same height as an eagle." Rosa was an eagle. Well, to say that an eagle can fly lower than a chicken means that sometimes Rosa, in Lenin's mind, was perfectly stupid and very obstinate, but at her great moment, she was an eagle, and of course there were very few Marxists that were eagles. And consequently, you get, even through all of these distended relationships, a kind of sensitivity to to the revolutionary commitment and the revolutionary genius each of the other. But that doesn't gainsay the fact that when Rosa analyzed the idea of a third international for 1919, she made this criticism. She said there has been only one successful revolution, and that is in Russia. And there is only one large communist party, and that is in Russia. And consequently, if we found an international now in Moscow, it will surely be under Bolshevik domination. And that means that the Russians will begin to generalize on their own experience. No, let us wait until we have major communist parties in other parts of the world so that we will meet as equals and not as clients of Russian largesse. All of which, of course, was a terribly penetrating critique right before Rosa Luxemburg died. The result being that the one German representative who went as a representative of the German Communist Party, of the KKD, Eberlein, who was a close associate of Rosa Luxemburg, was the only one to take a strong negative position and who believed that it was premature to organize that Third International. Well, on the face of it, in terms of what happened when these delegates gathered on the 1st of March of 1919 in Moscow, you would think it was premature. Don't forget that Russia was in civil war, that it was damnably hard to get there, that it was very dangerous to cross frontiers, and consequently very few delegates showed up. To found the Third Communist International, you had only 36 voting delegates at the founding Congress in March of 1919. And you also have 15 so-called consultative delegates who happen to be Europeans in Russia at that time, who have rallied to the Russian Revolution and consequently claim a consultative voice on the part of their country. Consider of the 36 voting delegates in 1919, 8 of them were Russian Bolsheviks. And they were Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin and Zinoviev and Harvey. And consequently, you see what the terrific weight of the Russians is at that very moment. Now, I told you that the people who were at that founding Congress really didn't represent much of anything. They represented a spirit, except for the Russians and the German delegate Eberlein. They were independent revolutionaries. They really were not there representing large movements or representing large parties. There was state, or they were representing a future, not a present reality. For example, the Italians were represented by a fantastic person, to be sure, but who had very little to do with the evolution of Italian socialism. It was Angelica Balabanova, and it's a name that you might really remember because she comes up very frequently. Well, I can tell. And Balabanova, well, she was a Russian. She was a Russian of Ukrainian parentage, Ukrainian Jewish parentage, quite wealthy, had grown up with a magnificent education, spoke fluently 7 languages, spoke Russian, German, French, English, and Italian. She had married an Italian socialist and consequently was marginally connected with the Italian Socialist Party. And she had had a very close and intimate relationship with Benito Mussolini while he was a socialist, and before his treason, after that, of course, she was very bitter. Now, Balabanova lived in Rome, and I saw her about 6 years ago. She died about 4 years ago. Went to Rome, I was in Rome and saw her. She was 86 years old at the time. We talked about these events and so forth, and I asked her about Mussolini. Now, mind you, she's 86 years old, and these events have happened so long before, and she said, gone. Real flame. A real flame. That Balabanova represented the Italians, and that shows how very marginal, really, a lot of this representation was. The French were represented by a military man, a captain named Captain Jacques Sadoul, who happened to be part of the French military mission, rallied to the Bolsheviks, and consequently became the French representative with no real backing by the Socialist Party of France at all. So that you have really no contemporary basis for saying that this is an international. The result is that in the discussion, Eberlein, the German, is very persuasive. He says, this is not the time to found an international. Let us wait until we really have organized these communist parties. And it's at that moment that there is the intrusion of an Austrian revolutionary named Gruber. Now, Gruber comes in with dust on his shoes. He has really traveled across all of these frontiers of Europe, and he comes bursting in. Now, Gruber was a metal worker, and was somebody who was very simple, naive, very big, very shaggy, very attractive from the point of view of all of this immense elan. And he came in and he said, look, I've just come from there. There's revolution in Austria, revolution in Germany, they're rising up in Hungary, everybody is waiting for you. Well, needless to say, Goldberg says everybody is waiting for you, and you are a miserable little group in Moscow, and you suddenly have the idea that you are going to found an international that will make the world revolution. Rakowski draws a motion, and consequently, the Third International approved, with the abstention of one, namely the German delegate. And when Lenin made his thesis for this founding Congress of the Comintern, he made his thesis in terms of what he thought was the crucial issue. And that shows really what the mood of the time was. The crucial issue in Lenin's mind, the reason it was essential to found a Third International, the crucial issue was not revolution versus counter-revolution. That was not on the horizon. There was no question in anybody's mind that great changes were going to take place. The real issue was the issue of communism versus social democracy. In other words, was a real communist revolution as against a false one, against a reformism, a la the British Labour Party, a la the Swedish experience, and so forth. And so Lenin says in his speeches for the founding Congress, the essential is that in capitalist society, there can be no middle ground between the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie and the dictatorship of the proletariat. All dreams of a third solution is the reactionary wail of the petty bourgeoisie. In other words, that we must form this international that will cut away all of the illusions of reformist socialism and really build what we have built here in Russia. An illusion, a dream, and yet it's 1919. And that is the 3rd of March that Lenin puts his thesis. And on the 21st of March, less than 3 weeks later, there is a communist revolution in Hungary. And that communist revolution in Hungary disturbed lots of people, is made out of Herbert Hoover's food mission, a very, very political act. It disturbed the Allies deeply. It looked like the real beginning of something in the Balkans. And it is worth to talk momentarily about that Hungarian Revolution and what the illusions were of 1919. That Hungary had a communist revolution seems very strange. There had been a social democratic party in Hungary before 1914, very effective, very reformist, very pro-German, very much in the tradition of the SPD. But during the war, the Hungarian working class, in the city of Budapest in particular, begins to become very radicalized. And the peasantry, which lived after all like chattel in these immense, huge estates that the great landlords of Hungary owned, these peasants are being used as cannon fodder in the war, and consequently there is the beginning of radicalization among the peasants. And the Russian Revolution of 1917, both in February and October, give a tremendous push to this radicalization process, so that you get a huge filtering into trade unions in the year 1917. 55,000 trade union workers at the end of 1916, 300,000 at the end of 1917, and many of those who go into unions go into them as what you would call revolutionary syndicalists, outside of their social democratic party, much more in favor of direct action, much more into insurrectionary action. So that you have, in Budapest and other industrial centers of Hungary, in January of 1918, huge strikes at the very time that you have strikes in Germany and strikes in Austria against the war and in favor of the Russian Revolution. All of which means that by the early months of 1918, you begin to get among the most advanced and the most revolutionary workers the idea that they want another party, a party that really will make a fundamental revolution. Now that idea grows in a very interesting way. it grows among prisoners of war in Russia, because the Hungarians on the German side fight in Russia. And there are by the tens of thousands, after all, peasants and workers who are conscripted into the Hungarian army. And what happens is that in the PW compound, there is a radicalization process at work after the Russian Revolution. And out of that comes a group, the so-called Bolshevik Hungarian group, led by Madison in Russia, that insists that there has to be ultimately another kind of a revolutionary party. Now you know there is that great insurrection of the 31st of October of 1918 in Hungary. Hungary is a defeated power in the war, and all through the month of October there is hell to pay. And basically, it takes the sign of the disintegration of the Hungarian army. What happens is magnificent. Men walk away from the army. They simply desert the army, which is one of the few acts, really, that they can perform that fundamentally not only opposes the war, but is a political act. They go away in droves and come back into Budapest and other centers and don't go home, but form soldiers, Soviets or soldiers' councils in which they begin to demonstrate and to make a liaison with workers who are demonstrating. And so throughout October, workers and soldiers really are beginning to occupy the streets of Budapest until that revolution of the 31st of October, in which these places are taken in the city of Budapest, and there really is a spontaneous revolution from below. Very much like the February Revolution in Russia, with this exception, that in Hungary, you do not yet have a party, a revolutionary party, that in any way can hook on to these activities and really canalize them and direct them. The result is a certain very real form of co-optation. There is in Hungary the equivalent of Maxoban, and he is Michael Karosi. And Karosi is a count, a liberal nobleman, who really sees the handwriting on the wall. And consequently, on the 25th of October, Count Karosi forms what is called the National Council. And the National Council is a kind of executive government, a rough government formed out of two bourgeois parties, the Radical Party and the Independence Party, and out of the Reformist Social Democratic Party. And consequently, you get a kind of socialist, progressive bourgeois alliance in this spontaneous council, which proposes the program, really, of the liberal democratic revolution. Because what Karosi's National Council proposed was to establish universal suffrage, a parliament, the free speech, all of the democratic liberties, and ultimately to take care of the social problems, to distribute the land and so forth, but not immediately. It was a classic liberal democratic program, and the great grandees of Hungary, really the elites of Hungary, saw that the handwriting was on the wall and considered this National Council to be their best possible hope in order to save as much as possible of the ancien regime. And consequently, the National Council is finally given power. Karosi is called upon by the Archduke Joseph, who is the emissary of the Emperor in Hungary, is called upon on the 31st of October, the day the workers are occupying the key places of Budapest, is called upon to form a ministry. And he forms a ministry on the 31st of October. By the 16th of November, he proclaims the Republic. So that you have a coalition of bourgeois and moderate socialists who have co-opted this kind of revolution from below and have organized this particular liberal regime in Hungary by November of 1918. However, an Hungarian Communist Party comes to be organized, and it is organized officially on the 23rd of November of 1918. Madison comes back from Russia, along with other radicalized prisoners of war, and between the Russian group of Hungarians, plus certain of these revolutionary syndicalists among the workers, plus certain very violent anti-militarists in the Socialist Party, to get a small nucleus forming the Hungarian Communist Party on the 23rd of November of 1918. Now, this Hungarian Communist Party is very small. And Madison, to his credit, if you think in terms of building a party as being part of a man's credit, to Belakun's credit, he had a certain kind of histrionic talent. And consequently, what the Hungarian communists did in late 1918 and early 1919 was to appeal essentially to what you would call London proletariat. They appealed to workers who were unemployed. They appealed to soldiers who were demobilized. They appealed to landless peasants who simply were wandering about and really were defunct. And of course, in the conditions of terrible economic straits, they began to put themselves at the head of one street demonstration after another until the communists began, especially in the cities, to diffuse their word and to pick up membership largely among those who really were not of the organized proletariat, but those who were at the very margins of society. But the cadre within which Hungarian communism becomes something, and this is important to know, the cadre really is the total collapse of anything else in Hungary. And you see, this is both the strength and the weakness of attempting to make a revolution under those conditions. The strength being that there will be a little opposition to your installing yourself. The weakness that you take over a society that is perfectly paralyzed and that is perfectly impossible from the point of view of any development, which happened to be the case with Belakun's government. What happened in Greece was this, that you see, in ending the war, Harvey had signed an armistice agreement on the 18th of November with the Allies. And that armistice agreement was to be temporary until there was a peace treaty. And that armistice agreement was absolutely decimating for the Hungarians. They lost half of their territory. And they lost half of their territory because of the predatory will of the new succession states. Yugoslavia, Romania, Czechoslovakia, everybody taking a bit of Hungary. And that, of course, because there were so many of these depressed nationalities that belong with these other Slavic groups. And consequently, you get a decimation of the country. Now, beyond that, you get the successor states, the Romanians, the Czechs, and the Serbs, beginning actually to penetrate not only those zones of Hungary, but even going further. In short, Harvey's government begins to function within the framework, really, of organized imperialism. There are imperialist attacks right on that particular state, all during the period of time that Harvey and his national government are trying to function. And it's precisely in that cadre, you see, that you get total economic disorganization and that you get the opportunity for the Hungarian communists to rise in influence and in importance. Now, essentially, the Social Democrats, who were part of the Harvey government, played the game that the SPD did. They played the game of helping to repress the Hungarian communists. They suppressed, on the 3rd of February, the government did, the communist press. On the 9th of February, they decreed that no communists could be in trade unions. And on the 20th of February, they suppressed the Communist Party and called it illegal and arrested 69 of its leaders, including Belakun. But all of that, you see, is not a final result. All of that means that for the moment, the working class gets more radical, the peasantry that had wanted land becomes more radical, and when, on the 19th of March of 1919, the Allies insist that the lines of demarcation that they had drawn in the armistice of November be observed, and that the Hungarian government agreed to those lines of demarcation and withdraw behind them. When that is the case, then you see the only hope is with the communists, because behind them is the Soviet Union. And consequently, the hope is, if you give power then to the communists, maybe the Soviet Union will play that game of driving these imperialists out of Hungary. And so you get not only economic pressure, you get a real nationalism at play at this particular moment, a certain patriotism. But the communists are small, the Social Democrats are big, and Belakun agreed on the 21st of March to a fusion of his party, his Communist Party, with the Social Democratic Party. It becomes the Hungarian Socialist Party, and Harvey resigns. There is proclaimed an Hungarian Soviet Republic, the head of it, the Communist Belakun. So begins the 133-day experience of Belakun. Needless to say, it failed. And it failed because the pressures were terrific. And a lot of those pressures, hold on. The pressures were not least from Hoover and the Allied food mission. And you get Hoover's famous message of the 9th of June to Wilson, in which he says we must do something to prevent this Hungarian communist example from spreading to other Balkan regions. And finally, it is Hoover who pens that note that the Allies sent around not only to the Hungarian government, but to all of the opponents of that Hungarian government, those white Hungarians, those who are already beginning to plan counter-revolution and who are centered in Vienna. The Allied statement of the 26th of July of 1919, if food and supplies are to be made available, if the blockade is to be lifted, if peace is to be settled, it can only be done with a government which can choose terror and madness. In other words, there will be no relief until this communist regime is overthrown. The story of those 133 days is complex, but it suffices to say that on the 1st of August of 1919, Admiral Harvey, supported by the Allies, supported by Polish and Romanian troops, and supported by all kinds of counter-revolutionary forces in Hungary, leads an army into Budapest and unseats this government. Unseats it, it is said, to end the Red Terror. The Red Terror of De La Cruz took 234 victims, and the White Terror of Admiral Harvey, within 2 months, had killed 5,000, imprisoned 75,000, and driven 100,000 into exile. And those 100,000, of course, Lukács and Mannheim and Hauser and all of those great communist intellectuals who have been part of this particular experience. The Hungarian Revolution, which after all proved that the Third International was founded at a vital moment, failed and proved that it was perhaps premature to found that Third International. But beyond Hungary were other things. Let him put it always in the same terms. You lose a battle, but you do not lose a war. This is still 1919, 1920. Compare, if you please, that founding meeting of the Third International with the meeting the next year in July of 1920, the Second World Congress, full of parties, full of elan, full of people from the Third World, and you see what has happened in that one short year, and maybe in those terms, it wasn't premature.